This last session is focused on workforce development related to broadband in the BEAD program. I'm Rick Gordon, the Director of the Office of Statewide Broadband. And as mentioned, this is the final of 4 presentations on the requirements for our broadband and digital equity plan. Assisting us with the tasks are members of CTC Energy and Technology, who are working with to prepare the plan, and also assisting with the plan preparation is the Maryland Broadband Cooperative and the Eastern Shore Regional GIS Cooperative. Next slide, please. So our agenda today is an overview of the infrastructure and bipartisan infrastructure law, a broadband overview, workforce development considerations, and some next steps. Next slide, please. So while we're here, the Broadband Infrastructure Law, or IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment in Jobs Act, will provide over $42 billion for broadband deployment to the NTIA. NTIA will administer the funds that will ultimately go to the states. Each state is guaranteed $100 million with additional funds based on the percentage of unserved addresses within the state. To access the funds, the states must submit a 5-year broadband plan that addresses the state's broadband needs. Over the next few months, we'll be conducting stakeholder meetings, outreach conferences, and surveys as we gather data that will direct our plan. Next slide, please. The BIL also includes a digital equity component, the Digital Equity Act, with $2.75 billion in funding. The Act establishes 3 programs: state planning grants for states to develop their digital equity plans, state capacity grants for states to implement their plans with funding available over 5 years, and then competitive grants where other entities, including states, nonprofits, and jurisdictions can apply for funding for digital equity projects. The Act prioritizes various covered populations, including low income, disabled, racial and ethnic minorities, rural populations, aging, incarcerated population, veterans, and people with disabilities. Next slide, please. So what is digital opportunity and equity? Well, it's broadband access, accessible and inclusive content, devices and technical support, privacy and security, and digital literacy and skills. We will be working on all of those issues. Next slide, please. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, next slide, please. The elements of a broadband network. First is the last mile. This is the service that comes to your home. Then there's middle mile fiber that brings that last mile to long haul fiber that takes it to various points of presence for connection to the internet. Next slide, please. There are various sources that provide minimum bandwidth estimates. For the most part, a lower bandwidth is suitable for many until you start adding additional users. While an evening bandwidth's needs can be met with 100 megabits per second service, when you start adding other family members, the usage starts rising. Next slide, please. For BEAD, Congress directed NTIA to use the FCC broadband definition of 25 megabits down by 3 megabits up as the unserved speed for their funding programs. This differs with the Treasury definition used for the ARPA program, which is 100 megabits down by 20 megabits up for unserved. Service to be provided using federal funding for both programs, however, with some exceptions, is 100 megabits per second synchronous. Next slide, please. There are several types of broadband infrastructure. There's fiber to the premise, hybrid fiber coax, or HFC, which is what most cable companies provide. Then there's DSL service, rarely meets broadband speeds. There's some fixed wireless, sometimes cannot meet broadband speeds and sometimes can. And then there's also mobile wireless, 4G and 5G covers that many have with our cell phones. Next slide, please. In general, fiber to the premise is considered the best type of connection. It is considered future-proof, or at least future accessible or future expandable. However, with the just released DOCSIS 4.0 standard that for the cable companies, HFC can rival fiber's delivery. Next slide, please. So some questions for our participants to think about. What are the gaps and challenges towards achieving connectivity for your organization, as well as for the residents and community that you serve? And what are some of the barriers preventing the closing of those gaps? Next slide, please. So some of the funding opportunities, next slide. The BIL has specific requirements directing NTIA on the use of the provided funds, as well as timelines. So 2023, we're in our planning phase. 2024, we'll be in our releasing our grant programs related to that planning. And 2025 through 2028 will be the deployment of those funds. We must focus on unserved locations first, and then we can go to underserved locations, those that can't receive service above 100 by 20. Then we can look at community anchor facilities, and finally, low and affordable housing. Next slide, please. So how will BEAD funding work? So we're still in the planning stage, but we expect many of the programs that we've been developing to work as they have in the past. We'll also grant to local jurisdictions an ISP for deployment. BIL has specific requirements for fair labor standards that will have to be complied with. In other words, there will be reporting. We'll work with the Maryland Department of Labor and other stakeholders to develop a workforce development plan to ensure we have a well-trained and sufficient workforce to implement the program. Projects must provide low-cost options to eligible subscribers and participate in the Affordable Connectivity Program. Next slide, please. So part of our work on the BEAD plan is gathering input from various sources. We have several surveys posted on our website, as well as a contact form that we ask you to complete. Next slide, please. So workforce development considerations. Next slide. There are several real risks to the BEAD program. There's supply, logistics, and workforce. Supply is actually having the ability to purchase the items. Fiber optic cable is currently has a very long order line right now, as do some cabinets and electrical equipment. The distribution and logistics, getting stock, finding warehousing, finding storage, secure storage for those materials. And finally, the workforce. There's design elements, field work, construction, project management, and quality assurance that all need to be addressed. Next slide, please. So broadband construction requires many different skills. Linemen, equipment operators, including boring equipment, bucket trucks, backhoes, requires laborers, directly related to fiber optics or fiber optic technicians, splicers, installers, and testers. The continuing operations of a broadband network require many of these same skills. So what are the most realistic and sustainable career paths for fiber optic technicians? Next slide, please. As we start working on our workforce development plan, we'll meet with various stakeholders, including internet service providers, contractors, career and technical schools, trade unions, and community colleges, as well as our various unionized representatives. Next slide, please. So the workforce plan for our BEAD program, or our BEAD plan, must address compliance with federal labor and employment laws, skilled workforce activities, including developing a highly skilled workforce, and ensuring that state subgrantees do the same, equitable training and workforce development activities, ensuring fairness and diversity in our workforce, and contracting requirements that reflect these requirements. Next slide, please. Workforce development mitigation can be incorporated into the state plan in multiple ways. We can require it or parts of it. We can encourage it by providing points to grants during the application process, and we can promote it by developing programs that ensure training. However, we can't do any of this without the cooperation of the internet service providers and construction contractors who will be building and operating the projects we fund. So we all have to work together as we develop these requirements. Next slide, please. So we've developed a workforce development survey that will help us as we start preparing our plans. We ask that you answer a few questions for us, and the survey is posted on our website, which I'll show you the URL for shortly. Next slide, please. There are a number of activities that a workforce development plan can include: core curriculum, adoption of fiber optic technician certificates, development of career paths, develop incentives for training the trainer opportunities, prison technical programs, and the establishment of career technical education programs. Next slide, please. So within your WebEx, there should be a question and answer box. If you have questions, you can post them there. We'll take them and try and answer them as we're going. So we encourage you to do that now. There are questions out there. So Josh, you want to pick up the questions and we can start going through them.
Yes. So the first question, thank you, Rick, is I work with individuals who are experiencing homelessness. The shelters all have consistently terrible Wi-Fi. Is there any way to use the Broadband for All grant to help boost service?
So currently, the answer to that is maybe. We are working on some programs for instance, for public housing. We also have what we call a gap network program that do work in these areas. However, as you saw, the BEAD programming is restricted to unserved. We'd have to see how NTIA felt about considering, say, a homeless shelter as an unserved location. The digital equity program that we mentioned, however, can address those locations because that would be an equity issue. So I would say that we would probably switch to our digital equity side for funding something like wiring or improving service within a homeless shelter. Next slide, or next question, please.
Major barrier for my clients finding employment is access to reliable cell service in order to use sites such as Indeed or LinkedIn. How could this broadband program help?
So that cellular service is an interesting quandary for us. We don't consider cell service because it's a mobile service to really be a broadband service. What we're focused more on is bringing a wired service or a wireless service to a household, a fixed service. So some of the cellular providers do provide a fixed wireless solution that operates off their cellular towers. Some of those services may be more conducive to assisting your constituency. We're also working on a device distribution program for low and moderate households based on the U.S. poverty guidelines that will get people off of their cell phones and onto an actual device that they can then utilize for Indeed and LinkedIn. So next.
What are your requirements regarding transparency on partnering with local organizations in order to deploy services?
Trying to understand the question. So the way our programs work in general, if a local jurisdiction applies to us, they have to come to us with a partner. And that partner has to be outlined at the very beginning of the application process. For our other deployment programs, we work directly with the internet service providers. So as far as partnering, we know who the partners are as we enter into even the application stage. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but if it didn't, please maybe re-enter it and be a little bit clearer on exactly what you're asking. That's the best I can do. Next one, please.
Can you provide an example of accessible digital content that you referenced?
So, digital content generally, to be accessible, has to be able to be converted into various languages, maybe typeface, or be provided as a voice rather than a text document for those who are visually disabled. That's what we look for as we talk about accessible digital content.
Where can we find the plan for our local workforce development board? This is referencing Montgomery County.
I honestly don't know the answer to that question. We've been working with our state Department of Labor and working on our plan. The Department of Labor may be able to better answer that question. Unfortunately, I cannot at this point.
Will you be sending the PowerPoint out to participants of this webinar?
The PowerPoint presentation will be published on our website. If you do a Google search, OSB Maryland, you should end up there, and it's down at the bottom of the opening page under public meetings. This is considered a public meeting. Next.
Would a public access show, local cable public access show that discusses Wi-Fi requirements be digital content?
I don't believe that would be digital content. That would be part of maybe a digital inclusion program. If you, however, put it onto a website, I think then it would be considered digital content. Josh, do you have a better answer than I do for that?
No, not better than I think what you stated. I think that content was then streamed or put onto the website, that probably would be considered digital content at that point.
Thank you. Next one.
What are some of the programs and or projects you are looking to implement at anchor institutions such as libraries? Most of the patrons do not have access to the internet and use the library as their means of virtual connection.
So for the BEAD program, what we are looking for at anchor institutions is the connectivity. Part of the digital equity side would be the programs that a library might offer regarding digital education or education of digital use, or some of the equity programs. So, again, BEAD is mostly deployment and equitable deployment. Digital equity is the training and the use of internet services.
We do not have additional questions at this time.
All right, unless something pops up, why don't you go to the next slide? And one more, and our website address is at the bottom of that. So thank you for joining us. If you are a workforce development person, we'd appreciate it if you took our survey. The survey link is on our website, and we also need to know, so we don't count on you for something that you can't provide. If you'd like to provide feedback outside of the survey, their BEAD-related comments can be emailed to osb.bead@maryland.gov, and digital equity comments can be sent to osb.de@maryland.gov. We're trying to keep those comments separated because they are two separate programs, and we have to develop separate plans for each one. So, so there is one more question, Josh.
Yes. Are there key points of contact for each county or region?
So we are just getting started with this program. Ultimately, the answer to that would be yes. But that will come as we develop the workforce development plan. So, as I said, thank you all for coming. We appreciate it, and we really appreciate it if you could take our workforce survey and talk more about the difference between BEAD and digital equity. So, BEAD is the $45 billion deployment program. And that's basically to make sure that all households have access to a broadband service. Digital equity is making sure that people are able to utilize broadband services, and everything from applying for various state and local services to applying for jobs to just utilizing the internet safely is more of the digital equity and inclusion side. And we have plans. We have to submit plans for both of those programs. BEAD is broadband equity, access, and deployment. With the equity portion, there is ensuring that we are being equitable in our deployment methods. The digital equity side is their plan and funding program is geared towards making sure that broadband is affordable and inclusive in its use. All right, I think that was our last question. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to working with you and our stakeholders as we go forward.